planning. I've been, just as background, I've been working exclusively with nonprofits for the last 20 years or so here in San Diego as CFO, usually interim, part-time CFO, sometimes occasionally CEO of different nonprofits. So let's go to the next slide if you don't mind, and and we can either go to the next one. If I occasionally use a lot of Drucker quotes, because he was one of my professors in school, so that's why I tend to use a lot of those. But there's essentially 5 components of strategic financial planning that I want to talk about in a little more detail. Multi-year budgeting linked to outcomes, what-if scenario planning and downside analysis, program outcome scoring and ranking, and then 4-dimensional funding stability in setting of your reserve targets, and alignment of capital and operating structure. So we can go on to the next one. Next slide. The first one, we'll talk about this a lot, and anybody who's participated in any of my presentations in the past, this is one of my hot topics. But really talking about a multi-year budget that's linked to outcomes. And I want to define that as a 3 to 5 year operating budget, updated annually, in which mission outcomes are the top line of the budget. Not revenue, not expense, and then expense, it starts with outcomes, then actually expenses, and then revenues at the bottom. And then we talk about, is there a funding gap to meet those outcomes at the top? Embedded in this process, or in a multi-year budget, is metrics that, like cost per outcome, that we can then use as we talk about moving into the future years and how those numbers are changing, as opposed to just some guesses at top numbers. Built into that, and we'll talk about on the next slide, would be this what-if analysis. But the benefit of doing multi-year budgeting is that it links the strategic plan to the money that's required to deliver the outcomes that you're trying to deliver. And it shifts the whole budgeting mindset away from what I call annualitis to a longer-term strategic perspective. The reality is most of your outcomes are not going to be accomplished in the next year. So why are you only budgeting on a 1-year basis? We really should be budgeting to match the longer-term strategy. As you work through this as a team, as a management team, and your board, to the extent you involve them in the nitty-gritty process, you have to agree on the measurable outcomes, which is a huge step and a huge process. You have to talk about what is the cost to achieve these, where's the expected sources of funding associated with achieving those. All those things require this cross-functionalization, cross-departmental integration and understanding of how everything kind of contributes to the success of the organization. So by doing this, it's just a huge piece in the puzzle, okay? So we can go on to the next slide. The next piece, it's built into the multi-year budgeting, but it's really a standalone process. You really need to do what-if scenario planning and downside analysis. I define this as the ability to have a base or an expected case over the next few years, and then the ability to change key variables in that process, such as where the revenue is coming from, your salary and benefit costs, based on coming up with different scenarios. The variables might allow for the increases and decreases in the items and show the impact on the funding gaps. Then you add to this idea, you add to it a defined downside analysis. And what I tend to use as my starting basis of downside analysis is I use the 2008-2009 financial situation, that crash and everything. As you know, markets decline 20%, revenue declines 20%, costs go up by 10%. You know, all these factors that impact your outcome, your numbers. And you build that in as the entire budget has to use this downside scenario, in addition to the ones that are more likely or more possible that you're really thinking are going to happen. Obviously, moving forward, we're all going to be talking about some kind of a pandemic or revenue shock, a fundamental revenue shock that might last 12 to 18 months. The process, the benefit is that the process of identifying and exploring all these different scenarios, the management has to talk about, okay, if this happened, what would we do? How would we think about the response? What's our, how would our approach be on this? One of the things I do at the beginning of every budget year is I ask each budget manager, if we took your department budget, whatever it is you're managing, and increased it 25% for each of the next 3 years, what would you spend it on it and why? And conversely, if the expenses went down by, we cut your budget 25% for each of the next 3 years, what would you cut and why? And what are the impacts and the outcomes by either one of those scenarios? It forces some really difficult questions. The contribution is that you start to build as a management team this mutual trust and candor of how to talk about things and how to approach them, and you build this ability to think through what's going on and what might happen, so that when the actual unplanned events happen, which of course they do, you've already set up a framework for discussion and how you're going to interact and talk about all this. And it creates a rapid ability to move on to the real solutions in this crazy crisis that's coming, that might come. Okay, so we can do the next slide. Program outcome scoring and ranking. This is new to a lot of organizations, but it's really valuable, especially if you've got multiple programs, more than say 3. You're forced to deal with this big chunk of stuff, so it's really worth investing the time to do it. But I define it as a systematic, objective process of measuring each program's contribution to the success of the overall mission of the organization. So that's kind of the first step. Where's that connection? And then you use a standardized scale. You have to come up with this. It's not simple. It takes a lot of work. But it encompasses the number and the quality of the outcomes you're expected to produce, what the alignment is with that program, with the overall strategy, what's the net financial contribution, what's the administrative and executive burden to put this in this program to manage it ongoing, where's the community support, and what about fundraising availability? Is this something you can easily raise money for, or is difficult? What you end up with is given a score. You give everybody, each program, a score of say 1 to 100, depending on how many you've got. Some of my clients have 20 programs or 25 programs, so you might want to use 1 to 100 scale. And then you rank order every single one of those programs. I usually use the case where back in 08-09, one of my clients, the board and management had already gone through this process. We had built the multi-year budgeting. When we had that revenue shock, what we did is we went into the board meeting the following week, and we had already pre-decided, here's the programs that we're going to cut, not this, we're going to cut 10% across the board, which is the wrong answer. You want to cut those programs that are contributing the least to mission success. So it's a lot of work to do this, and it's not popping up as a simple thing to do, and especially the first time you do it, it takes a couple of tries, a couple of years to get this really good. But it allows, again, the board and management to talk about how are we going to do targeted cuts in the right places and why. The unseen benefit is when you're going to take on a new program, or if you're considering an acquisition of another nonprofit, you can rank order that program or all the programs of the other nonprofit and against your current situation. And so if your average program score is say 50 at this point in time, And when you look at a new program that you're thinking about bringing in, you run it through the same analysis, and it needs to be at least a 51, or you don't consider bringing it in because it's going to bring down your average. What you want is you continually to add programs that increase your program success ranking, basically, and you want the first ones that should go are the ones that are reducing your program success ranking. The contribution of the culture is really this idea of objective and systematic thinking, and not just, well, my program is great because I've been doing it for so long, or I'm just such a fan of it. It forces everybody in the organization to think in a very measurable way about what they're producing and how the success of the overall organization is happening because of their particular program and how things do rank. This idea of your common understanding of priorities and processes to make informed decision, it's just this management skill that gets developed in this process. So it's, I'm a big fan of it. Again, a lot of work and relatively new to a lot of people, a lot of organizations. So we can go to the next slide, thank you. This and the next one are kind of a, it's one of my favorite questions is that people say is, well, we should have 6 months of operating reserves, right? And I said, where do you get that number from? What's your basis for thinking about that? But somewhere in so many textbooks, people have put that 3 to 6 month number, and everybody's stuck on it. And every organization is so fundamentally different that 3 to 6 month reserve target is meaningless. What you really need to do is an annual review of all your funding streams, take it against a 4-dimensional funding stream format, which I'll show you on the next slide, and weight it against by dollar amounts, and then talk about how you want that funding stability to change over time. If today you're at a 2.3 and you really want to be more stable, you want to get it up to a 4 or a 3.5, it's unlikely to be at a 4, but you want to increase it over the next 3 to 5 years. What kind of revenue streams do you need to take on, and which ones do you need to move away from to make that happen? And it just becomes an annual process. What it does, the benefit is it allows management to target the reserve levels of whatever reserves you're going to build up in a very objective way, not just some 3 to 6 month number. And it also starts to build in this idea of this full awareness of the riskiness of the funding that you've got, so that as things change and happen in the future, those unexpected things, you can weigh it against the particular stream. Why this one we expected to be fairly risky, this one we didn't. Why is this happening, and where's this changing? If we want to be more stable or less stable, why? And that's just a great discussion point amongst everybody. It really allows you to align your management team with the nature of the funding streams that you want and are working towards. Because if you keep them too separate, people don't realize that if you've got a highly risky, unstable revenue stream, it might be very big from time to time, but it might also go to zero from time to time. You need to be able to live with that as an organization and accept it as part of the overall funding risk that you're taking on. So let's take a look at the next slide, where we've got this graphic. And I like to say I developed this literally with the board chair of one of my clients, who's literally a rocket scientist. And we used to joke about what's not on here is some specific numbers, but how many digits we should take out the answer to. So the whole idea, I don't want anybody to get caught up that it's some exact science that we're talking about, but it's really, instead of just a 3 to 6 month idea, let's talk about take every single one of the revenue streams and stack it against, say, in my mind, these 4 dimensions work. But if you take it on the top one, you want to say, okay, what's the nature of this payment stream? Is it an ongoing payment stream, or is it one time? right? And obviously something that's ongoing has higher stability, and something that's one time is lower stability. And it's going to be somewhere along that continuum between ongoing and one time, right? Then we can come down on the right side where we talk about the nature of the transaction. Is it a contract for service, which many of our, what people call grants are, or is it really just a unilateral donation? Somebody's just giving the organization money to do what the organization sees fit to do. The contract for service is more stable than somebody making a unilateral donation. The unilateral donation is not, it's just not that stable. It happens because of that particular donor, or it's that type of donor, but you can't really plan on it like clockwork, whereas a contract for service, as long as you deliver, and as long as that service is in demand, you should be able to count on that revenue. As we keep coming down the bottom continuum, is where's the source of the funding? Is it like federal government on the one end, which is fairly stable? Yeah, but it's still fairly stable compared to an individual who literally could die tomorrow, right? Now the federal government might die in a couple of weeks here, but we're getting, I'm trying to be funny, I guess. So if it's an individual, it'd be relatively unstable, and if it's the federal government, state government, all that sort of thing, just look at that along the continuum to get that sense. Then the fourth dimension is on the left, which is the risk of the commitment, right? Or where's that coming from? Is there any commitment in this funding at all? Or is it in a federal government legislation, if you take at the very top, that's, to change that, to have that funding go away is pretty unlikely, because just the fact of changing the legislation in any way is pretty difficult. You know what that funding is going to be for the next 3 to 5 years usually, versus if there's no commitment, it could go away tomorrow. And so what I usually do is I have a scale of, the continuum is a 1 to a 4 on each one of the 4 continuums. And I take each revenue stream and I layer it up here, and I say, is it fully to the left, fully to the right, or somewhere in the middle, and pick a point. Again, it's not absolute science, but it's some level of objectivity. And you do that for each one of the 4 dimensions. And then you weighted average that sum of those numbers, and for each of your revenue streams, and you'll come up with a number of somewhere between a 1 and a 4 overall for your funding stream. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're at a 2.5 and you say, we like the level of stability, this kind of stability that we're at seems to fit with us and seems to work well, we don't need to make a change in that, then you know that when you add more revenue, new program revenue, it's going to affect that number, so you want to keep it all in balance. So if you're at 2.5 and you want to stay at 2.5, and you bring in a 3, you're basically becoming more stable. There's and I never interpret this completely right. Young's benefit theory, who my colleague Dr. Lamb is really, really informed and teaches on. But the way I interpret Young's is really, you are what you eat, or you eat what you are. Do you eat to live, or do you live to eat? And the most nonprofits, in my experience, live to eat. Any money coming in is good, and so I just want more of it, and I'm just going to go find it. Versus the ones that are more strategic in their financial perspective, eat to live. Money is a means to accomplish these outcomes that we've set up in the beginning and we're working towards. And so if you're primarily a 3.5 funding stability organization, I can tell you a lot about the way management thinks, sometimes it's a little too stable and they don't like change, and prevents you from doing maybe a little bit riskier things because it's going to bring in risk. So you want to make sure that if you're at 2.5 and you're going to bring in a 3, and it's going to bring you up to a 2.75 on a weighted basis, maybe you need to go find some other revenue, another program that's going to keep you at that 2.5 level. Otherwise, you run the risk of becoming more stable in your funding than you really want to be from a management culture standpoint. So we can go to the next slide. This one gets fairly, can easily get fairly complex, but all it really is we look at the makeup of your balance sheet, your fixed versus your current assets, your liabilities versus your net assets, and we look at your income statement and we say, do you have high versus low fixed cost, right? Do you have a lot of labor or very little labor? What's that relationship between labor costs and non-labor costs? Is your revenue fee-based or is it donation-based? All of these are kind of the structure of your capital structure and your operating structure. And it's really important that you keep these in alignment, because if you have high, well, I'll talk about that in a second, but you end up with staff inefficiencies when you get out of alignment. And so you want to be very conscious that the changes you're making make sense, and that over the next 2 to 3, 4, 5 years, they're going in the direction you want it to be. The classic situation is an organization that's property rich but cash poor. And I can think of one client off the top of my head where, you had the CFO was spending, I think it was 4 to 8 hours, half to a whole day a week managing vendor payments, because they didn't have enough cash, but they had a whole lot of property and buildings and that sort of thing. And by selling one property, they created a whole lot of cash that took the time that the CFO spent on vendor payment management from, say, 4 to 8 hours a week down to 4 to 8 hours a month. These were no longer the hot topics. And so what could happen is the CFO could focus on things like a maintenance improvement process for all those properties, and it just dramatically changed the flow of everybody in the organization, where they were spending their time and their energy on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and allowed them to shift to more of a strategic perspective instead of getting stuck in literally getting through another day, another week, another month. I think the biggest benefit is this idea that your strategy of your organization should not be dictated by your structure. It's kind of an old concept that everybody's pretty familiar with, I think, but too often when your capital structure and your operating structure are out of alignment, you tend to be brought down to allowing your structure to drive your strategy. But when you're very conscious about making sure that we've got the right alignment of cost and operating and capital structure, you're able to then let your strategy drive those things and not the other way around. An organization, so the contribution of the culture is when you get an organization that's got it matched, they're able to be more strategic, and they're really, when those crazy situations happen, those unplanned events that are going to happen, now hopefully not all black swan events, but they're basically unplanned events, unplannable for events, you're in a good position because you'll understand your strategy. You can adapt your strategy and not be stuck and not fixated on the way you've always done things and the way you're set up to operate. You're more flexible and more ability to be strategic in your actual day-to-day activities. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide. And really, to summarize, I got through all that pretty quick because I didn't have any questions. So, but in brief, I know, or when I'm working with a client to create a culture of strategic financial management, it's one where I'm looking to see does management identify, discuss, and model a range of possible outcomes and financial scenarios. Are they doing that? Is that a regular thing, or are they just focused on their day-to-day activities? But are they doing that? Do they prioritize their programs and target longer-term funding stability? Is that mix of those? When you're doing it, it's strategic. If you're not doing it, it's pretty obvious, and people are just doing their thing. You get a lot of that silo management. People are just focused on their own programs. And do they require the strategy to drive the structure instead of the other way around? Is their first response always, well, we can't do that because we don't have any cash, because we don't have we've got these buildings, but we can't do this because we've got too high of a fixed cost, or that's all secondary. Let's change that and focus on the strategy of how we're going to accomplish these outcomes. Very few, if any, nonprofits do all 5 of these. It's especially if they don't do it aggressively and formally doing it. Good managements are almost all doing it, at least in their mind, and they're thinking, and they're always saying, what if we did this? What if that happened? And so it's really, what I'm talking about is formalizing some of it, as opposed to maybe don't necessarily try to do all of it tomorrow. To the extent that they are practiced and people are doing this stuff actively and formally, it creates this culture where those unknowable events or unplannable events that happen, and they always happen, how well the organization responds to it and how proactive they are instead of reactive. There's always, of course, a little bit of reactive, but it's, are you gonna take advantage of these situations that come up, or are you just gonna get, beaten down by it? And so it's really, how do you thrive when these situations occur? With that, I think I'm pretty much done. I don't know if there were any questions that have come in on the chat box. Pardon?
There's a comment for you.
Okay.
Not a question.
All right. Okay, so somebody's looking for a bigger basket. Yeah, so maybe it was too many, but if we definitely have time. I don't want to waste everybody's time. If you don't have questions, or you don't want me to go deeper on any of these things, I don't want to waste your time, and you can get on with other projects that you might have in the day. But I'm here and available for any questions that might come in. But other than that, I don't really have more planned to go over today, other than digging deeper if anybody wants me to.
Give it a few minutes, but there's no comments coming in.
Okay, I think I put everybody to sleep, which is not an unusual situation. For those of you that did join us, thank you for signing in, and please reach out if there's anything I can answer or address on a one-on-one basis. Okay, with that, thank you. 2, 3. Okay, I'm back. I think we did have a couple of questions that I wanted to take a crack at. I think one was on, can we pull that one up? Oh, there we go. What are the thoughts about investing time and personnel in a department that isn't revenue generating but could be? So my bias is I don't have any fundamental problem with that. I'm even a big fan of investing time and personnel in departments that aren't going to be revenue generating, because otherwise my world would get pretty thin and I'd have to cut my fees. So finance is generally one of those that doesn't necessarily generate revenue. But what I'd love to do is, the way I would turn that question a little bit is, how can we improve the quantity or quality of our organizational outcomes if we invest more time and more money in this department? I think that's the better way to phrase that. And then the next level up would be, why is a dollar invested here more effective at increasing our longer term outcomes than a dollar invested somewhere else in the organization? But I'd be focused less on, it's really about the impact on outcomes is what I'm looking for whenever I think about a budgeting. So expenses to me are neither good or bad. Expenses are just means to an end. Everything is about, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the best way that we, with our collective skill set, can make that happen? What do we need to do that? And where are we lacking if we need that to happen? So, is there any other questions? Sure, please. Okay, how do you get your team on board to pivot toward more revenue generating work rather than what they are used to doing? I think switching to the outcomes that you're trying to accomplish, being really clear on what it is the organization is trying to do, and getting people excited about that and understand it and invested in understanding the outcomes and their contribution to it, allows you then to go back and question, does the way you've been doing things contribute maximally to these outcomes? And help me draw that line, and then how do we make the shift if maybe there's a better way? And some of it is just sometimes bringing the horse to the water, but really they need to be part of defining that water. They need to be defining those outcomes and how they're going to contribute to make it happen. Obviously, if people want to just do things the old way or a way that isn't improving the quality of the outcomes, that needs to be a separate discussion at some point. But it's all about defining and tying everything to the outcomes. Okay. Any other items or questions? And I think there was a comment earlier about the prevalence of my way of thinking. I would say it's prevalent. Most boards tend to think a lot like this, and especially those really forward-looking nonprofit boards, as well as a lot of for-profit boards. So if you have in your board, if you've got a lot of for-profit people on, they're generally thinking about this sort of and thinking this way. And so I think it's more, somewhat less defined or formalized, but I think it's out there. It's really a matter of just talking this way instead of, let's do another budget. Let's take last year's numbers and increase them 5 or 10% and hope that we have another good year. I can remember one CEO telling me, a new CEO that I worked with, bragging about how in 20 years of management, this particular CEO had never went over budget, and how I had to work with that CEO to kind of understand that that's not a good comment because it's focused on the wrong things, and how do we focus on what we're trying to do as opposed to a particular expense line item. If you accomplish 50% more outcomes, or the quality of your outcomes improved by 50%, and you spent an extra $1 over budget, I don't think the board is going to be complaining about that. But if we talk only in revenue and expense, we're stuck with those kind of discussions. So, sure, another item. Yeah, well, you know, people are fighting for resources, and so the question, the comment, there's been a lot of pushback between departments, especially during this time. And I think, again, to the extent that, you know, when the next crisis comes, to the extent you've been doing, or to the extent you've increased the culture of strategic financial planning, that pushback will shift towards the right sort of things instead of just pushing back or battling for dollars amongst themselves and trying to retain their staffing or their salary levels. And that's, I think, the main point of this is, again, not everybody or very few are doing certainly all of this, but to the extent start doing it today, then when the next crisis hits, you're going to be in a much better position to capitalize on that, and hopefully some of this these department infighting will be forced to have already had these discussions and talk more forward-looking as opposed to just battling in the arena today. So, okay, any other questions? Okay, Thanks, Joel. I really appreciate your questions, and I think I put everybody else to sleep. Oh, another one slid in. Okay. Okay. Would you advise diversifying projects as we pare them down during downturns, or focusing on one type of project? Or does it depend on the mission of the organization? And can you scroll down on that question a little bit? I'm not able to read the whole.
I can't scroll down, but it says, or does it depend on the mission of the organization and what the community needs most?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I think it keeps coming back to, you know, when I was talking about the program ranking and scoring. One of the things on there, one of the measures you want to make sure you capture is administrative and executive burden. So sometimes a lot of relatively small projects takes a lot more adds a lot more administrative burden and takes a lot more executive management and leadership on it. And sometimes that's not a good thing. So I think it's to a certain extent, and I know this is a throwaway answer, but sometimes it's like that, the Goldilocks, you know, you want to be just right. You don't want to be too much or too little. But it always depends on the mission of the org. And I think that if you're going to give up, you know, identifying what the community needs in the short term, you need to make sure that it is a short-term then solution that you're putting in place and not changing the entire structure of your organization to meet a relatively near-term problem. Because your mission today, again, is probably not going to get accomplished today. It's probably a multi-year project, and it's all about who you are as an organization. For that to shift fundamentally because of a crisis, you don't want to have a long-term shift in that, because that means that your original mission maybe wasn't appropriate. Now, you always want to be thinking about, should the organization's strategy shift? But now it comes back to that 3 to 5 year plan. What are our outcomes going to be now, and why, as opposed to just automatically shifting to somebody else? Okay. Okay. Well, thank you again, everybody, and again, reach out to me directly if I can answer anything one-on-one.